All right, thank you. Okay, so how many people here do enterprise software? Anyone? Oh, quite a few actually, okay. Mostly what, how many designers do we have? Most designers. Is there any developers here? Oh, okay, so pretty much both here. I'm kind of going to talk about this somewhat at a high level, kind of for both, and kind of mention the process from all different angles. So, all right. So again, I'm Ryan Johnson. I started in graphic design. I got my degree at Oklahoma State University. I then worked at an energy company called the International Ground Source Heat Pump Association, the longest name ever. And there I did textbooks and magazines and web work, emails, all kinds of stuff. We were a pretty small company, so you kind of had to be the jack of all trades there. Then I went to Hobby Lobby, and there I did a lot of marketing, emails, all kind of print, web, all kinds of stuff. And also I've done graphic design freelance since, probably I was like 17 or something. I've been doing it forever. Bands, churches, doctors' offices, restaurants, all kinds of things. And about 5 years ago, after doing a lot of web work and stuff, I slowly made the transition to become a developer. And so I've been doing that for about 5 years now. And I would say I probably do more development there than design at this point. And I also have a custom guitar company now, so if anyone needs a custom guitar, hit me up. So, just, show a tiny bit of my work. I've done, like I said, a lot of logos. I love doing logos, a lot of print stuff, a lot of web stuff. One of the recent projects I did was working with this food truck, Whole Latte Pie, which if you've not heard of it or not been there, it's like the best pie ever, so make sure you go there. They are not sponsoring this, just so you know. Anyways, the reason I'm telling you all this, kind of my background and stuff, I noticed a pattern through every single thing I did, whether it was logos, print, web, and especially software development. The band KISS helped me out through all of it. Not really. KISS, it's the saying, keep it simple, stupid. It's a cliche saying that everyone kind of hates, I feel like, but it's cliche for a reason. And it's like the most important thing that I feel like a lot of people forget. And with software development, and especially enterprise software, it's probably more important than anything. So kind of to show you an example of some bad design, I didn't want to pick on anyone, or especially if they're just someone random off the internet. So I decided to pull up a piece I've done that I look back on not very fondly. This is for a band called Finding Z, but that's not super legible, and people would ask me like, oh, is this findings or andings? And so by not keeping that KISS mentality in my mind, I messed up the most important part of the poster, which was the band's name. So the fact that the art maybe looks cool doesn't mean anything at this point. So let's look at some good design now. Logos, I think, it's one of those that it doesn't matter if you're a designer, a developer, a person off the street, a good logo. They're things that they stick in your mind. Branding's everywhere. Logos are super important. And so, obviously, this is one of the most famous ones of all time. It's super simple. McDonald's, again, super simple. You see the M and you know exactly what it is. You either love or hate it. Apple's another one. Their logo is their name. It's so simple that it's genius. But even they, at one point, didn't keep that in mind. Their first logo it's not ugly or anything. It's just, it's not simple. Can you imagine that being on computers now? And then a favorite of mine, and I think a favorite of a lot of developers, is the FedEx logo. And the reason I like to bring this one up is, especially people who are not designers, when I point out the hidden arrow, they're always angry with me. Like, I can't unsee that now. Why did you tell me this, you know? And so I mean, I'll tell people about that, and then years later get like a text like, that stupid arrow. So, but it's genius though. It's so simple. It just says it says what the company is, and it's clean. So, and I wanted to pull up their old logo. I just found it kind of interesting. I don't know how many people know this, but I guess initially they went with red, white, and blue, and had the name Federal in the logo to attract the Federal Reserve Bank as a customer, which failed. Their attempt failed. But I still find that interesting, and I don't think they care at this point. I mean, they're one of the biggest companies on earth, so. And the KISS logo. I mean, it just says what it is, but it's one of those things that even if you don't like their music, you've never heard it, you know that logo. I feel like as a kid, I knew what that was even before I heard the band, so. All right, enterprise software. What is enterprise software? Now, I took this off of Wikipedia, like everyone does. Enterprise software, also known as enterprise application software, is computer software used to satisfy the needs of an organization rather than individual users. Such organizations include businesses, schools, interest-based user groups, clubs, charities, and governments. Enterprise software is an integral part of information systems. I think an even better quote that was on Wikipedia was from this person who's a developer that I don't know who he is, but he said enterprise applications are about the display, manipulation, and storage of large amounts of often complex data and the support or automation of business processes with that data. And I think that's kind of the important thing to get out of this is that if you don't work in enterprise software, the reason keeping it simple is so important is this is very, very complicated stuff often that, we're talking about people that, a lot of times these people used to just use giant Excel files and physical paper, and they spent, a month to figure out someone's bill with all this, weird paperwork and stuff, and hopefully our goal is to, turn that into like a day-long process or something, so it's complicated. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the roles in development, just in case anyone doesn't know some of the terms I'm using. Pretty much usually on a team for these types of enterprise software projects, there's a graphic designer, a UI UX designer, or a web designer, or sometimes all three. It just depends on, how much money, how much time. There's a BA, also known as a business analyst, and they kind of figure out, the logic. They basically talk to the users and figure out, okay, what the process is, what the formulas are, stuff like that. Then there's the software developers, of course. We know what they do. Well, if you're not a software developer, you have no clue. You just think it's magic. And if you are, it's just, it is magic. Then there's the project managers. We know what they do. And then there's the users. And that doesn't just mean someone who's using the software, but also just maybe the client or the company you're working for. So as a designer, your goal in conjunction with your other teammates, the business analysts, the developers and such, is to keep it simple. You're taking, like I said, you're taking very complicated process and you're trying to make it easy and fast to save them money and time. All right, so the steps of software development. So I think a lot of us have seen this before. This is what most people think are the steps of software development. The first step being requirement gathering and analysis, and we'll go into these here in a sec, but design, implementation and coding, deployment and testing, and maintenance at the very end. However, I don't really think it's that simple, and I think anyone that's worked on any of these projects knows that's not true. Typically you do your requirement gathering and analysis, you work on the design. You implement the code and the design, and then you realize you need some more requirements gathering, you know. You update that design, you update the code, and you do your deployment and testing. And again, you realize, okay, we need to talk to them again and figure out, you know, some more requirements, or maybe this thing didn't work, so you update the design again. You know, and it kind of repeats itself until everything's good. So it's just not as easy as putting things into little boxes. All right, things to keep in mind. Like I said, processes are very complicated. I think a lot of times people think that when they go to do some, you know, the business analyst side of things, that they'll ask them, you know, hey, how does this process work? What's the formula? And they figure it out and they code it. But really, it can take a lot of time. I mean, you know, sometimes it'll be a month or two in and you're like, oh, okay, I was understanding that wrong. I mean, and that's typical, and it's not something that you should feel bad about. It takes a long time to understand. I mean, you're talking about people that they've been doing these jobs for years sometimes, and so they forget to tell you important, you know, information that they just do, or you know, sometimes maybe they're not doing a step. I mean, it's very complicated for them too. So, and eventually, you will probably know more than the users. Especially if you're a developer, I think, you know, well, really, both. I mean, I don't know. It's one of those things that after you've done the design and you've done the coding and everything, you understand the missing pieces. So then you go talk to them, and eventually they're almost going to come to you. I feel like. I mean, at least in my experience, because you're really gonna know the process more than they do, which will also help you down the road ask better questions. And I don't just mean at that particular client, but you know, your next project. After going through this, you'll know, okay, they're probably forgetting about this thing. And even if that's not the case, it's good to ask, because sometimes that can, you know, bring about other ideas. And sometimes the processes change during development. You know, I work in government a lot, and so laws can change, and all of a sudden your formula changes. Maybe the money they had for this particular thing is gone, and so you have to figure out other ways to do it. And so it's important to be flexible, and I think going back to the whole KISS mentality, keeping it simple is what makes it easy to be flexible. All right, let's talk about the requirements gathering phase a little bit. Now, though I keep saying, you know, keeping it simple is the most important thing, it's also really important to know what the user does. And this first step is huge on requirements gathering. And on the projects I've done, I was always, as soon as I got put on a project, I was always so eager to like think about the logo and the colors and all this kind of stuff and what technology, but I kind of realized that it's really best at this point to just take a step back and don't worry about thinking too much, just absorb it, listen, and because it takes a long time. But this is the part where you will be learning the business process and business logic. And like I said, this will continue throughout the project. I don't think it's as easy as getting it all right away, but you want to as much as you can, obviously. The other big thing that I think is important to take away is focusing on the 1%. And to me, that means those things that users say will never happen, but then they happen. You know, I've done so many projects where there's a particular process where we have it all figured out. We've done tons of testing. It's out there. Everyone's said, oh yeah, this is perfect. And then this scenario comes up while, you know, it's live or something. And we're like, we've never heard of this. And they're like, well, that never happens. But it did happen. And it's not the user's fault. It's one of those deals where, you know, this may have happened 10 years ago and they just haven't thought about it, you know. So it's not anything bad on a client or anything, or you for not asking. It's part of it. But it's important to keep digging and thinking about, you know, designing for and coding for that 1%, the thing that never happens that always does happen. Then we go to the design phase, and again, keep it simple. I think designing for implementation is important, and what I mean by that is keeping programmers and users in mind. I think it's easy to get ahead of yourself and want to be creative and use, certain technologies, but one thing I keep thinking of now that I've become a developer is like sometimes things that, yeah, they sound like a cool idea, but it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money. And, these are clients with, they have these issues that they need done right away. It's just not as easy, it just makes it just seems smarter to think about the code and think about how long it's going to take. All right, implementation and coding phase. All business logic should be in the database. Actually, all business logic should be in code. Really, I just wanted to say those two things because developers are, especially ones that work on the back end, are really angry right now and having a rage blackout. This is one of the biggest arguments I hear about, and none of this really matters, though. I mean, it does, obviously, but the biggest takeaway, my biggest point here is that keeping code organized and easy to follow is really the most important thing. And, there's going to be arguments of where to put business logic and such. And I know for designers, you don't care about any of this anyways, but I think really writing good code that's easy to follow is the most important thing, because down the road, you're going to look back and, on something you did that you have to fix. And if it's easy to follow, great. If it's something that's complicated and you got business logic everywhere and because you had these arguments about it, not a good thing. All right, now, update design again. I mean, after you've put the code out there, you're going to start showing the design with teammates and users. And this is the part where you want to be asking a lot of questions. Like, okay, here's how this page flows. Here's how this form works. And you have to keep remembering to ask about that 1% because there's still, it's a constant battle to figure out these things that never happen. Then we go to the deployment and testing phase. So during this time, the users are really going to be looking at your code, or not your code, your designs, the UI, UX. And I think this is the best time to just say nothing, put it out there, and watch them break everything, because they will. And it's really a good thing. I mean, you're going to learn a lot this way. I think, even simple things like maybe on a text box, you only allow them to put numbers because you expect them to put numbers. Well, don't tell them that. Find out. If you tell them that, then they're going to be like, oh, this box is only for numbers, and it's fine. But if you don't tell them that, you may find out that, oh, actually, there's occasions where it needs to have, the letter M there for some reason. I don't know. So it's good to tell them nothing and just see what happens. And then after all that, the users have broken everything, which is a good thing. You can go fix your code. You can fix even design. If something's not flowing the way you thought it would, this is when you can fix it. And again, ask about the things that never happened, the 1%, because there's still things that will be forgotten at this point. Now's the maintenance phase. I think the thing to think about this is whenever you've got your website, your web application, desktop application, whatever, when it's up there and running, it's not over, as we all know. Things change, businesses change, even the users themselves change, and so I think it's important to go back to that KISS mentality of keeping it simple, because that's going to make flexibility easy down the road. Let's talk a little bit about web applications. In computing, a web application or web app is a client-server computer program which the client, including the user interface and client-side logic, runs in a web browser. The thing is, nowadays, web applications are becoming the most popular thing in enterprise software, because it's one of those deals where users know the internet. They know how to use a browser, and so at least from a UI, UX perspective, I just feel like it's so much easier for them to adapt to that than some desktop program. And not that you can't make a desktop program look and feel maybe similar to a website or flow like one. But I just think that everyone knows websites so well now. It just makes sense. And so now we have a lot of web application frameworks to help us out with that. Popular ones like Angular, ASP.NET, Django, et cetera. These are, these are great programs. I've only used myself Angular and ASP.NET, both great. So then there's the front end frameworks, and I think these are pretty important for enterprise development. Personally, I think a lot of times with designers, there's a desire to want to be creative and do your own thing, and that's not a bad thing. And I'm not saying don't do that, but I think with enterprise software, it's important to keep things simple for everyone involved and speed things up. And so these front-end frameworks are great. They're like, you have this base where, because they're simple and clean. It's not like they have a lot going on. I mean, they're not complicated enough to where if you have a certain vision, you can't modify them. But they're perfect for, okay, now I put Bootstrap on a software enterprise system, and now everything is responsive. It looks good. If a developer comes around and has to do some front end, who maybe doesn't know front end typically, it's easy to find documentation. They can just say, put this, column MD12 and the layout works. No big deal. So I think these are really important. And like I said, with CSS, it's easy to change. You can update these. It's just I think keeping it simple, and then maybe if you have time, you can change some things. But even then, I wouldn't change too much, just because with enterprise software, they're very complicated, and this just makes it easier for everyone. Now let's talk about desktop applications a little bit. And now I know these are kind of going away somewhat in favor of web applications for enterprise development. But there's a chance that a lot of you will have to work on some of these, or it may be needed for some reason. And I guess the big thing I would say with this is to not really be afraid of them and act like they're ugly. I think that's the general consensus, is that things like something like WinForms or WPF is an old technology, and people maybe they don't even want to do a job because it has those. But with enterprise software, I don't think that can stop good software just because it has older technology. I think there's a lot you can do with it. I'll give you an example, actually. So a while back, I had to do an app in WPF, and WPF was made in 2006, back when XP was around, so it's old, But there are UI toolkits that you can find out there that people have made it look more modern. And then you can take that and make it a little more modern yourself if you feel necessary. And so at the end of the day, after using that and using, I think the one we used for this particular app was called MAHAPPS, MAHAPPS, I think is the one. And you can't tell that it's software from, 2006. You just can't. So I think there's something to be said to not fearing old technology, and not, even if you're working on legacy software, you can go in there and spruce that up. There's nothing saying you can't. So, and some of them too, it's like WPF. The code is actually very similar to HTML and CSS. So I wouldn't, as far as the front end code, so I wouldn't be, don't be afraid of the old software either as far as a learning curve. I don't think there really is much of one. It didn't take me long at all to kind of make the switch. All right, now we'll go over some basic design tips, which, a lot of you being designers, this is I'm probably just repeating what you've heard a million times, but always use a grid for layout. Super important, but I've seen designers who eyeball things or just, kind of throw things up there. And I think it's important to use a grid because you can create a better flow that way, and it'll look cleaner, and it'll be easier for people down the road to come in and make it look consistent, which is my next point. Keeping things consistent is super important, and with enterprise software, I think that is a harder area to pull off sometimes, because you may have processes over here that are, super complicated and have all these forms. Then you have one over here that's so different, you don't even know how to quite make it look like that. And so that is a hard part of software development as far as enterprise software, but I think being consistent is super important because especially for the users, they know if they see things, they know what they do, even if they haven't used that section of the app before. Or for developers and designers down the road, they know what to put up and it's still going to look good. And I think focusing on usability over style is very important. This picture, we've all seen pictures like this. I just like that picture because there's been so many times where I've done that. I've walked through the grass and then felt bad that I've like messed up their grass, but don't make the sidewalk to where I have to walk an extra 5 minutes. So, and we do that all the time in software development. So I think it's something that, or in with graphic design, we think about making things pretty basically instead of how they're used. Oops. And keeping navigation clear is really important, and another thing that a lot of people miss, I think. One way is using too many icons. I have on here, use visual clues and icons. I think that's important. If it's something that's really important, like you want to go to the next page, sure, put a big old arrow. But a lot of times, in especially enterprise software, where it's very complicated and there's all these processes on a page, or whatever, there may be 20 arrows. Well, maybe that's not the way to do it. So I think you want to use visual clues and icons, but kind of, make it so people know where to go and it has a nice flow. For instance, with forms, a lot of people just kind of throw up forms and think like, okay, the name, it makes sense, it should make sense. But if for instance, with this example, if you put them all in a line like this, it's easy. People know this, do this, next step, and it also doesn't look scary. It's just, it's just a form, no big deal. And then with this sign-up form, if you landed here, you would know right away, okay, I'm missing these fields, these are required, and because that button is a big green sign-up, even if you're colorblind, you know that is a giant button telling you that this is the next step. And speaking of color and colorblind, color can convey a lot of information, so I do think it's important to use it. This form, for instance, okay, I've obviously messed something up on the email, but the great thing is, for people that may be colorblind, you also can use things like having icons down here so that it has feedback. And okay, so now everyone knows that there's not really, it's pretty obvious to know that you've messed that email up, no matter what the case is. And accessibility is something we definitely don't want to forget, and I would say some of you probably saw the talk last week or last month from Aaron, but if not, and you're interested in accessibility, check that out. It's really in-depth and really good, and it's very important, but I'm not going to get into it since he already talked to it. And then an important thing for both designers and developers is don't try to reinvent the wheel. I've heard developers they have this great idea for how to do a database or do the code somewhat different, or even designers, they want to mix this form up and all this. Enterprise software is not really the place to do that, I think. It's complicated enough and these are big clients. These aren't, this isn't your personal project. I think it's important to keep it simple and things that have been done before so people can go look at documentation. They can easily know, okay, I've done this thing before, whatever. And design for your audience. There'll be times where you may realize that, for instance, I worked on an app where we were specifically told, these people using the app, they are not used to technology, so walk them through every single step. And I'm sure that if some of you use this app, it might be frustrating because it's like, okay, I get it. I know what to do next. Yeah, just let me do it. But the people who use it, it works great because they don't know technology and they just, okay, put that in, what's next? Got it. So you definitely have to design for your audience. And again, I want to reiterate to designers, take it easy on the developers. And I think a good thing for anyone who's just a designer, it would be good to learn some development skills because one, it's only gonna help your career, but also you're going to learn what is hard for a developer and what takes a lot of time and money. And so I think by learning those things and by keeping developers in mind, you're gonna save your project a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of frustration. So yeah, again, my name is Ryan Johnson. You can hit me up on Slack at Ryan Johnson if you want. I work at MY Consulting Group. And I just want to thank Techlahoma. If there's any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious, what programming languages you learn?
I think it's muted. Press the button. I think it's. Okay, yeah, so the question was how I went about teaching myself to code, basically. I really just jumped in. Luckily, since I was already a designer, I had stuff to do, but I started working at this company and they let me jump in on projects with them development-wise, but it did take a lot of outside, doing stuff on my own time. Code Academy was a big one for me. I really liked that one. I think it especially helps for designer types because it's very visual, and I think that's one that I really liked because you had your code here, you had your explanation, and then you had your output. And so it wasn't like I also did some of the sites like Pluralsight, for instance, and those videos were great, but I often found myself like having trouble following because it's just all this information. It's it's almost too much, especially if you're more of a visual person like a lot of us designers are. And so I think something like Code Academy or Free Code Camp, those are great places to start. And then I think you just have to dive in and do it. So, yeah.
My follow-up is, for a beginner, what code would you recommend? Everyone says code. What is that, HTML? Should I learn JavaScript? Like, what should I learn as a designer to help me understand my developer?
So the question was, if you are new, what code should you start with? And I think your best bet is to kind of ask around and see what people are doing. Because personally, I don't think it matters what language you do. Once you know an object-oriented language, they're all kind of similar enough to where you can kind of learn on the fly, I think. So I think the important thing is asking people around you that you talk to regularly, see what they do, so that if you need help, you got it, Whether that's coming to a group or maybe just seeing what technologies have jobs. I know that in this industry, Microsoft, or around Oklahoma City, Microsoft, stack is really big, so that's always a good one. But anyone else? Yeah, right here. Right. So the question was, can I speak to the distinction of what's different between enterprise software development and design in general, basically? I think really the biggest thing is just that because it's more complicated, there's more money involved, there's more people involved, and usually more of a time crunch, I feel like. It's just that it's always important to keep it simple. I can't stress that enough. It doesn't matter if it's a logo, it doesn't matter if it's an illustration, whatever, but I think with enterprise software development, it's a little bit more important just because of how complicated it is and how many factors are involved. So, yeah.
Question regarding is people are being asked to use their own devices in enterprise environments, whether it be tablets or mobile devices. The responsive aspects of design for that use case, are you finding that much more difficult? Are you finding it fall toward that web aspect? What's your
Right. So the question was, as far as a lot of these companies may have people that need to use the app on different devices, whether it's tablets or phones or computers, and the question was, do I find that difficult, basically, or? Designing the new device using a responsive type application versus a typical desktop Right. Is designing for something responsive like that more difficult than a desktop app? I would say and again, this goes back to, using front-end frameworks. If you do it from scratch, yeah, it's a lot harder. I mean, you're gonna be in there tweaking with stuff all day long, and you're gonna constantly find things that have broke that you didn't think about. But if you use a front end like Bootstrap or any of those, then I actually think it's easier in some ways. So, yeah.
What's the most helpful thing a designer has ever told you about while working on a project for you as a designer?
The question was, what is the most important thing a designer has ever told me about a project, or that I've ever told a designer? Keep it simple. I mean, I don't know. I've gotten a lot of good advice over the years, but they all kind of go back to kind of the same thing. If you're not communicating what you want to communicate, then you failed. And the easiest way to do that is be simple, even if it's just, that's why so much of, a lot of times people make fun of graphic design because it's a word on a white piece of paper. And the thing is, though, that's the best way to communicate it, So I don't think it's bad design at all, but I hope that answers it. I know it's kind of a vague response, but yeah. Right, okay. So the question was, what kind of tools do I use to basically get ideas across in the early stages, since it's costly to code and things like that? There's a lot of, my mind kind of went blank on what they're called all of a sudden. There's a lot of tools like wireframing tools. And I've used, Adobe has one called XD, I think it's called. I use that, and then there's Balsamic, of course, a lot of people know that one. And then there's another one that I've used a few times. What's that? I haven't heard of that one. Vision? I don't know. InVision. Oh, yeah, I have heard of that. Okay. Yeah, there's several of them out there, and they're all fine. I mean, I've also just done them in Photoshop. I think a lot of us have, But it is easier to use things like, Adobe XD and stuff like that to show the flow and all that. And I would definitely, that program is probably the one I use the most, so I would recommend that one. But yeah.
How do you get developers who maybe don't care about design as much as you do?
Right.
Kind of like material design falls at 8-point grid, but you try to explain it to the developer and they're just like, whatever, it looks fine.
That's hard. Yeah. So the question was, how do you get developers to get good design and understand where you're coming from? And his example was, like a grid, for instance. How do you, if you have this 8-point grid, how do you explain to them why it's important to do this? In my experience, it's one of those where at first the developers I worked with were, and I hate to rag on developers, but I'm one of them, so I feel like I can now. Most developers they don't care what it looks like. As long as it works, they don't care. Let's put a bunch of gradients and some, puke yellow. I don't care. But I think after you do some successful design, just a little bit, all of a sudden they turn around because, for instance, where I work, no one thinks everyone, really appreciates the design work. And I think, the big thing for me was with some of these apps, whenever we showed it for the first time, I kind of felt bad because the developers have been working their tails off on this code and the complex database, and I threw some pretty colors up, and now at the first time we demo it, all they say is, "Brian, you did such a good job. It's so pretty." And it's like, so I feel bad for the developers sometimes in that regard, but I think because of those times, they get it and they appreciate it just as much as us designers appreciate the black magic, so of development. Good. All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.